Well, thank you very much. Yes, tonight I want to share with you this story of a very unique car that was sold only in Canada, the Acadian. Now, it was the result of many factors. There were shifting consumer demands. Uh, there were a unique Canadian marketplace. There was tariffs, yes, tariffs even back then, and a lot more. So this is the story of the Canadian Acadian and why it was so unique. It's also interesting that the Acadian was really so successful in Canada that it ultimately led to its own demise. It was replaced by the Pontiac Ventura, which was sold in both Canada and the United States. Now, to set the scene, I want to provide you with some historical background on why the Acadian was created. GM didn't suddenly one day decide to make a unique compact car for Canada. So let's look at a bit of automotive history. This will help you understand why the Acadian was created for Canada. Well, although tariffs are very much in the news these days, they're also an important part of automotive history in Canada. And actually, they were around long before the Acadian came out for the 1962 model year. In fact, there were tariffs before there were even cars. In the 1870s, the government of Sir John A. Macdonald applied tariffs on several imported products, including carriages. The hope was to help out some Canadian businesses. Canadians that wanted to buy a carriage, if it had been made in the US, they had to pay an extra 35% tariff or duty or tax. Not surprisingly, a lot of Canadians decided to buy carriages that were made in Canada instead. And the result was a really growing carriage industry in Canada. One of the most popular ones was the McLaughlin carriage. In fact, McLaughlin became the largest carriage maker in the British Empire and later became the foundation for General Motors of Canada. Now, when cars came along in the early 1900s, they were classified as carriages, horseless carriages, but carriages nevertheless. So that 35% tariff still applied. That's why it made good business sense for early automakers in the US to set up branch plants in Canada. Now, one of the first was Ford that set up a plant in Walkerville, which is now part of Windsor. The cars that were assembled in Canada could be shipped to other Commonwealth countries duty-free, unlike those that were manufactured in the USA. Soon, other automakers saw the advantages of setting up branch plants in Canada and shipping parts, many of them just across the Detroit River to Windsor for assembly. Among them, Chalmers, Dodge Brothers, General Motors, Hudson, Maxwell, Packard, Pierce Arrow, Rio, Studebaker, and many others. Also, there were tariffs on parts. At that time, they were 20 to 30%, which was a little lower than the completed tariff of 35% on completed cars. Now, a way to get around tariffs on the parts to not even have to pay the 20 to 30% was to use parts that were made in Canada. And soon, Canadian companies were making such items as lights, tires, and upholstery for cars that were assembled in Canada. The auto industry boomed in Canada in the teens and 20s. Now, as well as General Motors in Oshawa and Chrysler in Windsor, the city of Toronto also became an important part of the auto industry in the country. The Dodge brothers had a big factory in Toronto. So did Durant and Ford and Rio and Willys. Now, in addition to the plant in Toronto, Ford also had assembly plants across Canada in Vancouver, Winnipeg, London, and Montreal. General Motors soon followed suit. They opened an assembly plant in Regina, Saskatchewan in 1928 to make cars and trucks for all of Western Canada. In fact, from about 1900 to 1930, Canadian car factories produced far more cars than were sold in Canada. That peaked in 1923, when almost half of all the cars made in Canada were shipped to other countries. Canada was often the second largest vehicle producer in the world, behind only the USA. During the Second World War, auto production came to a halt as car factories started turning out munitions and military vehicles. After the war, production and distribution techniques had changed immensely, and those small regional plants scattered across Canada in the teens and 20s suddenly really no longer made business sense. There were other changes to the auto industry in Canada. First, export markets essentially disappeared. They dropped dramatically because former export markets, most notably Australia, began developing their own auto industries. And second, there were more imported cars coming into Canada than ever before. They showed a steady increase from about 20,000 in 1955 to 125,000 in 1960. That was almost one third of all the cars sold in Canada. It was also about double the rate of imports going to the USA. Uh, Generally speaking, Canadians like smaller, more economical cars than American cousins. So those two changes, the fewer exports and the more imports, had huge impacts on the auto industry in the 50s and early 60s. Auto sales were booming. There's a nice shot from the 50s. Suburbs were sprouting up. Two-car families became popular. And in those traditional times of the 1950s, dad often had a car to drive to work, and mom had her own car to run errands, do the shopping, and pick up and drop off the kids. So there was a real growth in the number of two-car families. And often that second car was something smaller and cheaper and easier to handle than the large family sedans of the 50s. Now, many of these were imported cars. They began arriving in North America in the early 50s, but that trickle became a flood by the late 50s, led by, of course, the Volkswagen Beetle, but also the Austin, Fiat, Renault, and many others. Lots of people soon found they preferred these smaller cars, even as main vehicles. Now, recession hit in 1958. Sales of big North American cars like Mercury and Edsel and Buick dropped off. However, compacts by Studebaker and Rambler saw increases in sales. Detroit's Big Three responded by bringing out their own compacts in the fall of '59 for the 1960 model year. There was the Ford Falcon, the Plymouth Valiant, and the Corvair was Chevrolet's entry into this new compact segment. Now, the Corvair was unlike anything else made in the USA. It had a rear-mounted, air-cooled engine. The trunk was up front. Now we hear about fronts these days in electric vehicles. Corvair had one starting in 1960. For ads, Chevrolet said the Corvair makes driving high adventure on any highway exciting going all the way. Well, it may have been exciting, but the Corvair was a little too different for a lot of people. The Falcon was the clear winner in the sales race, outselling the Corvair by almost a 2-to-1 margin. Now, at the time, cars sold in Canada had to be produced in Canada. Otherwise, they were subject to tariffs and duties. For example, the compact Pontiac Tempest was not made in Canada. A few of them were imported, but there were tariffs on them. So they really made them uncompetitive. In fact, during the first 6 months of 1961, as this compact car race was getting underway, only 393 Tempests were sold in Canada, compared to about 5,600 Chevrolet Corvairs. The main target, of course, was the Ford Falcon, which was clearly the sales leader. GM soon realized that a more basic and conventional compact was needed to take on the Falcon. So for the 1962 model year, the Chevy II was created. It was just slightly larger than the Falcon. It offered a choice of a 4-cylinder or 6-cylinder engine. Falcon and Valiant did not offer 4-cylinder engines. The Corvair was kept in the lineup, with the focus shifting to a sporty, well-handling car. Now, like the Falcon and the Valiant, the engine for the Chevy II was up front. It was rear-wheel drive. It was clearly aimed at the Ford Falcon. And instead of emphasizing the driving, as they did in ads for the Corvair, the Chevy II emphasized practicality and economy. Chevrolet billed it as an honest-to-goodness practical automobile fashioned for low-cost, low everyday upkeep. Well, the new Chevy II was a hit. In the first year, sales totaled 326,000. That's almost 1,000 a day, much better than the Corvair, but it still was behind the Ford Falcon. Meanwhile, in Canada, sales of compacts were taking a larger share of the market than in the US, as I mentioned earlier. Canadians, generally speaking, like smaller, more economical cars. In fact, going back to the 1930s, some makes like Dodge and Pontiac used smaller bodies and smaller engines in Canada compared with the US versions. Now, I mentioned that from 55 to 60, sales of of imports into Canada increased from about 20,000 a year to 125,000. By 1960, imports accounted for almost 30% of all cars sold in Canada, about double the rate of imports in the US. Now, here's another little wrinkle that led to the Acadian, and yes, I'm getting to the Acadian. At the time, Pontiac was a top-selling brand in Canada, even though in the US it was a little further down the list in the sales race. So when Chevrolet introduced the Chevy II for 62, it made really good business sense that Pontiac dealers in Canada would have a similar vehicle. There would have been a missed opportunity if Pontiac did not have a compact in their lineup. Otherwise, car shoppers who went looking for a compact car at their local Pontiac dealer would come up empty and would have to go down the street to a Chevy, Ford, or Plymouth dealer. The result was the Acadian, a thinly disguised Chevy II. As one writer in the Windsor Star said, Ted Douglas, he said, Chevrolet dealers, you see, have had an advantage with a Canadian-made Corvair compact. The Pontiac compact, the Tempest, has been imported and priced way out of line because of the heavy duty on a finished unit. Pontiac regular-size cars do exceptionally well in Canada, but a smaller model will help these outlets get into an area in the market which is the promise of real value. So the Acadian, very close to the Chevy II, same body, same mechanical components, same engine choices. Differences, well, the front grille, maple leaf logos on the front grille and the steering wheel. The base series was called the Invader. The top line series was called the Beaumont. Now, although the Acadian was sold at Pontiac dealers, nowhere on an Acadian will you see Pontiac. So it was identified just as an Acadian. Still, there were some ads of that era who referred to them as Pontiac Acadians. A lot of people in common usage call them Pontiac Acadians. For registration purposes, often they are listed as a Pontiac Acadian. Like a lot of words in the English language, it's really a matter of are you being technically correct or common usage. If people refer to a Pontiac Acadian, it clearly describes this car. There's really no confusion. And referring it only as an Acadian is really also correct. When the Acadian was introduced, the president of General Motors said, the Acadian will have our own Canadian styling. It will be the same size and same power as the Chevy II, a basic four-cylinder engine, about 90 horsepower, and an optional six developing about 120 horsepower. Canada Track and Traffic magazine said shortly after introducing the Chevy II, GM of Canada announced the Acadian. Despite the totally new and all-Canadian claims, the Acadian is simply a Chevy II with petty trim alterations and the usual maple leaf insignia traditionally bestowed on Canadian cars. Later, the magazine said it more simply, add maple leaves and presto, a Canadian car. Now, the Acadian name comes from people from France who settled in Atlantic Canada. During the 7 Years' War in the 1700s, some British leaders suspected that Acadians were not loyal to the British. The result was thousands of Acadians were deported, many back to France, others to Louisiana or other parts of the USA. Louisiana had been a French territory. It was now Spanish territory. Today, the ascendants of these Acadians are part of the Cajun culture of the Deep South. Now, the Acadian name was used for many products across Canada, a bus company, a credit union, restaurants, men's hats, a hotel, a stereo, even Acadia University in Wolfville, Nova Scotia. By the way, that Acadian name sometimes shows up in Louisiana because of the descendants of Acadians. Here's a newspaper ad from a newspaper in New Iberia, Louisiana, January 61. Pontiac dealership named Acadian Pontiac. Now, that was almost a year before the Acadian car was introduced to Pontiac dealers in Canada. So it's just sort of a flip of a car that became popular in Canada later on. And if you check the New Iberia today or parts of Louisiana, I found an Acadian auto and diesel repair shop. So it shows that Acadia is still a word used in Louisiana. Dealer literature for the new Acadian said, Low price and economy of operation that make it thrifty to own, spirited performance that gives you quick response in traffic and effortless cruising on the highway, distinctive styling, smart and sparkling that sets it apart. Now, some of the other differences, the very minor differences, the Acadian taillights were all red, unlike the Chevys II that were red on the top and clear on the bottom. If an Acadian buyer wanted backup lights, there were optional units separate in the rear bumper. On the rear panel trim, the Chevy II bow tie in the center was replaced with the Acadian logo in a large capital A and 3 maple leaves just above the keyhole. On the top end Beaumont, there was also a chrome spear that stretched right across the rear trunk lid. And like the Chevy II, there were the two engines available, the 4-cylinder as well as the 6-cylinder. The Acadian sat on a 110-inch wheelbase and was 183 inches long. Options included such things as power steering, power brakes, backup lights, and a push-button radio. Acadian prices started in Canada at $2,383. The Windsor Star reported General Motors is this year out fighting as never before for the economy car dollar. The company's two new weapons are Chevy II and Acadian. Here it explains a little more. Corvair was the lone Canadian-produced compact in this segment of the car market, and although it gained good acceptance, its sales did not attend the high plateaus of Ford's Falcon. So this year, the radical Corvair with its Pancake 6 rear-mounted aluminum engine is being sold as the sporty car for those who want something different. Bowing into the arena come the two new entries, Chevy II, and in the Pontiac lineup, the Acadian. So here it is. The Windsor Star, this was an ad for the Acadian, as said, here is a car excitingly new and refreshingly different, created by General Motors to satisfy completely those Canadians who want moderate yet family-sized dimension, ample room for 6 adults with plenty of legroom, headroom, and hip room, and doors that let you in and out with ease. The ad also said, proudly then we present the totally new car, Canadian in name, Canadian in style, Canadian in craftsmanship, the Acadian from General Motors. The Windsor Star used to have a test drive every week, and in February of '62, the writer Ted Douglas said, pedestrians and other drivers did a double take at that grill name Acadian this week as we wheeled the Pontiac version of the Chevy II. It's a stubby car with good visibility. Parking is no problem, handles well in traffic. In short, it's a playful, fun car. Acadian is a splendid and handy city car, and it will do for the occasional long highway trip. This ad from the Hamilton Spectator says, Acadian, made by Canadians. See the all-Canadian compact car. Again, we see the emphasis on this really being a Canadian car made at General Motors in Oshawa and not available in the US of A. I mentioned earlier that right after the Second World War, how Canada's car industry was faced with both fewer exports and increased imports. About a third of all cars in Canada were imports, about double the US rate, because Canadians like those smaller cars. Now, you can see how dramatically that increased over that short period of time. When John Diefenbaker's Conservatives won the election in 1962, the economy was struggling. Government debt was going up. The dollar was devalued. Unemployment rate was going up. So a series of economic measures were brought in, among them tariffs on about half of all the products coming into Canada. Different rates. The rate on imported cars was 10%. Now, at the time, most of the small imported cars that we see across the top here cost just a little bit below $2,000. Well, with the 10% tariff, that pushed the prices to pretty close to $2,000. It also really narrowed the gap between these imported cars and the Canadian-made compacts like the Acadian, the Falcon, the Frontenac, the Chevy II, and the Rambler and Valiant and others. So the gap was a lot smaller, and suddenly people were convinced, let's buy one of these Canadian-made cars, a compact. It's got a bigger engine in most cases. It's got more space. It's got more doors. It can hold 6 people in comfort. Um, so in 61, imports had dropped to 18%. By 63, that was cut in half to 9%. So the tariffs were taken off in March of 63 because they were effective in doing their jobs. They helped Canadian-made cars uh, sell more, including the Acadian. In the fall of 62, the new 63 models were introduced. One ad for the Acadian bragged about its fresh design and frisky performance and functional size. For 1963, the new midline Canso was added, where thrift and luxury are perfectly matched. And there was the premium Beaumont Sport Deluxe, which offered a floor-mounted automatic transmission lever and bucket seats, starting to get a little fancy. By the way, the Canso name is uniquely Canadian. In fact, the Strait of Canso separates mainland Nova Scotia and Cape Breton Island. The Canso Causeway goes across the strait and connects Nova Scotia and Cape Breton Island. I was able to drive across the Canso Causeway a couple of years ago. First visit I had to Nova Scotia, and I certainly look forward to going back there. Now, as well, there was a Canso Island National Historic Site, and there was an aircraft called the Canso during the Second World War. So that Canso name is a trim level, and the Acadian is very Canadian indeed. Power choices were unchanged. At the time, the Acadian and Chevy II were the only North American passenger cars to offer a 4-cylinder engine. There were also some styling changes for the second year, and here you can see some of the differences. The grille on the new 63 up at the top was changed. The 62 is on the bottom. You see it's got a number of horizontal slats, and on the newer model at top, it's more of a mesh design. And the Acadian logo is moved from the center of the grille in 62 over to the driver's side of the grille on the 63 model. Sales were strong for the Acadian. In fact, in the first 6 months of 63, a total of over 10,000 Acadians were sold in Canada, up from about 9,300 the same period a year earlier. Canadians liked the Acadian. By the end of the year, the Acadian was 1 spot ahead of the Ford Falcon in the Canadian sales race. For 1964, Chevrolet introduced the all-new midsize Chevelle, which fit between the compact Chevy II and the full-size Chevrolet. Now, at the time, the midsize Pontiac Tempest was not brought into Canada. So just like 2 years earlier, when the Acadian was created as a unique model for the Canadian marketplace, a new Pontiac trimmed Chevelle was created for Canadian dealers. It was called the Beaumont and essentially used the Chevelle body, added some unique trim front and back, including maple leaves, and lifted the dashboards from the US Pontiac Tempest. Now, this new midsize car used the name from the top line compact Acadian, the Beaumont. So this meant that the Canso became the top line for the compact Acadian. The mid-sized Acadian Beaumont sat on a 5-inch longer wheelbase and overall was 11 inches longer than the compact Acadian. Got a little confusing for a couple of years because if you said, oh, did you get an Acadian? It could be 2 very different vehicles indeed, whether it was a Beaumont or the Canso. For the compact Acadian models, the big news for 64 was the addition of more power, a V8 for the very first time. It was the 283. This was really just the start of the trend of more power in a compact Pontiac, but would certainly become a lot more popular as the decade went on. Trim changes were pretty minor. The front grille was simplified, 2 horizontal bars. The nameplate was moved up from separate letters along the hood to a badge on the grille. At the back, the Acadian crest above the trunk keyhole was replaced with a horizontal nameplate. So those were the trim changes for the 64 Acadian. Now, when we look at the calendar sales in 1964, Pontiac is the clear leader in Canada. even though it was third in the sales race in the USA. The midsize Acadian Beaumont actually outsold the compact Acadian models, and sales of both of them were down slightly from the previous year. Um, Here's the slightly, and one of the reasons was there was so much more competition on the market, including the Ford Mustang. So here's the 1965 restyled Acadian Canso Sport Deluxe. You can see the split grille, a Pontiac identifying feature. Um, and also the Beaumont was offering more luxury for buyers than could be found on the compact Acadian. The compact Acadian had to walk a fine line between more luxury and power while still bragging about its compact size and economical operation. Uh, Dealer brochure says the 65 Acadian is a low-priced, economical family car and proud of itself. It's good-looking, comfortable, roomy, and reliable, built to give you full value for your dollar, a perfect pitch to appeal to traditional compact car buyers. But it was also offering a few more things than in the past, saying that Canso Sport Deluxe is the most dashing of the Acadians. It's chic, handsome, and proud with bucket seats. Now, for comparison, there's a 65 Chevy II Nova Super Sport, strikingly similar, but you'll notice the grille is different. And often that was really the only difference between the Acadian and the Chevy II was trim differences on the grille and the tail lights. Here's another look at the 65 Chevy II Nova, or some of the styling changes for the Acadian. The rear taillights were enlarged, which they appeared a little bit bigger than previous years, and a little more chrome trim. Now, 65 was the final year for the mid-sized Acadian Beaumont based on the Chevelle. Starting with the 66 model year, the Canadian-only mid-size model was known simply as a Beaumont, and the Acadian name was used only on the compact car based on the Chevy II. So while the compact car is really the focus of this presentation, it's important to recognize that there were also mid-size Chevelle-based Acadians in 64 and 65. So they certainly weren't, Acadians certainly weren't only the compact cars for their entire life. There was this 2-year exception where they were both small and medium-sized. Now, although tariffs had slowed down imports, it had not stopped them. And as well as more cars coming in from other countries, there were other change was the reduction in exports. These two factors were really starting to threaten the future of the auto industry in Canada. The head offices of the automakers in the US were very interested in these threats to their Canadian operations. The US automakers wanted to see increased efficiencies in their smaller and older Canadian branch plants. Now, some in the US even thought that it would be possible that Canada might take steps to nationalize the auto industry. That was something that had already happened in other countries. It was something that the US government didn't want. The big three automakers didn't want it. The United Auto Workers did not want to see that happen. So, with the Canadian auto industry facing these serious problems, possibly even a complete shutdown, the Diefenbaker government set up a royal commission to study the auto industry and come up with suggestions for survival and growth. Well, there were a few years of negotiations, but a deal was reached. The US government was preoccupied with the war in Vietnam and civil unrest at home. It wanted to avoid any kind of a trade war with its neighbor and largest trading partner. So in 1965, Prime Minister Pearson traveled to President Lyndon Johnson's ranch in Texas to sign the Auto Pact, a deal that essentially removed the international border when it came to cars and parts. It didn't take long for automakers to alter their production strategies to obtain the most efficient production. New auto plants popped up in Canada. General Motors opened a new plant in a Montreal suburb, Saint-Therese, in the fall of 65. Ford built a new plant near St. Thomas, Ontario. The specialization of models soon followed. For example, when the compact Hornet was introduced in 1969, the American Motors plant in Brampton, just outside Toronto, supplied all of the eastern half of North America, while in the western half of the continent, It was supplied by a U.S. plant in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Now, there was also specialization at Chrysler, well, all of them really. Um, Chrysler phased out production of Chrysler and Valiant models in Canada, increased production of Dodge and Plymouth lines, many of which were shipped to the US. Chryslers and Valiants then were shipped in from the US. And this was really quite different because the inefficiency earlier, Chrysler, for example, would make Dodges for a few months, then they'd shut down and retool and make Plymouths for a few months. In the pre-Autopack days, shut down, retool, make Valiants for a few months, and so on. So very inefficient. And the Autopack really meant economies of scale. And it was an example of how free trade in other industries could work. And later on in the years to come, we saw the wider Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, then the North American Free Trade Agreement. And really, these followed the overall principle of the Autopact. Now we've got CUSMA, and here we are now wondering what the future may hold for CUSMA as it's renegotiated later this year. Back to the Acadian. Both the Acadian and Chevy II had new styling for 66. They had larger tail lights that were set in small fins. They had hooded headlights, and this carried over for 1967. Dealer brochure said 1966, the big year for Acadian, the year Acadian has taken on an exciting new personality. It's lower and wider. Interiors are roomier, more comfortable. Luxury abounds. Now, while the Acadian was still the smallest and least expensive product at Pontiac dealers in Canada, its original selling point at just 4 years earlier of being economical was clearly shifting to luxury, performance, and roominess. So it was no surprise that this is when they dropped the four-cylinder engine in Acadians and Chevy IIs. Of course, years later, four-cylinder engines would come back in North American cars. You can still see the Acadian grille is divided with the big letter A in the middle. For 1967, there were some minor changes, including a new grille. The parking lights moved from the bumper into the grille. Ads promoted the Acadian as the easy car from General Motors. Go easy. The trim size, sleek-looking new Acadian goes easy on your pocketbook when you buy it and as you run it. Now, spring of 1967, the headline says to discontinue Chevy II and the Acadian. And it says, the first line there, if you can read it, General Motors of Canada announced Monday it will discontinue manufacture of Chevrolet, Chevy II, and Pontiac Acadian cars at the end of the 1967 model run. Well, this again was a result of the Autopack. The headline might be slightly misleading. The first paragraph clarifies that GM Canada is discontinuing making the Chevy II and Pontiac Acadian. If you read further down, it says the cars would be produced in the US. Again, economies of scale. But with this news, a lot of people were concerned, and a lot of people didn't fully understand how this new Autopact was working. So GM had to take out these big newspaper ads saying the Acadian was still being produced and that they would still make cars in Oshawa and jobs would not be lost. This ad says, it has recently been reported in the press that General Motors will shift production of its popular compact lines, Acadian and Chevy II, to the United States at the end of the 67 model year. Some erroneous impressions have apparently been created by these statements, and we'd like to correct them here and now. The moving of Acadian and Chevy II production is part of the realignment of North American production made necessary by Canada's Automotive Trade Agreement with the US. Production of other GM models will be stepped up in Canada at the same time as the exchange takes place. And then in bold letters underlined, the smart, thrifty Acadian and trim value pack Chevy II will continue to be available throughout Canada. There was a major redesign for 1968. Both the Acadian, the Chevy II on top, were longer and lower and wider, sportier bodies. Convertibles and station wagons were dropped. You could only get a two-door sedan or four-door sedan. It was now on a 111-inch wheelbase, also more engine choices. The biggest in the Acadian was 350 cubic inches. So again, this year we're seeing the continued trend away from economy and towards style and performance. One ad said, everything about the 68 Acadian is totally new. Everything. Acadian is a big breakthrough for 68 with longer, lower four-door sedan and fastback styled thin pillar coupe. It's the reason why people who can afford to pay plenty for their next car won't have to. Acadian has remade the scene. Another ad said, 68 Acadian, make it simple or make it swing. Your choice. Completely new for 1968. Big design breakthrough in the lowest price class. Fastback styling, superb performance and handling, biggest ever choice of luxury, comfort, and power options. There were very few changes for the 69 Acadians, but now air conditioning was offered for the first time. Now, very few changes for 1970 as well. The taillights were enlarged, and I don't know if you can quite make it out there, but in the center of that steering wheel is a red maple leaf, sort of Acadian's way of saying, I am Canadian. Now, I talked about the shifting market, and we've been looking at compact cars, but of course, in the late 60s, one of the biggest changes were all the pony cars like the Mustang, Cougar, Barracuda, Camaro, Firebird, and Javelin, and also muscle cars started by the Pontiac GTO in 64. It was a matter of putting a really big engine into an intermediate body, and quickly everyone was in the game. Everybody had their own muscle car here. Lots of variety and very popular for a few years in the mid to late 60s, but times were changing. And with the growing consumerism movement of the late 60s, there's a lot of questioning of these high performance cars and the huge engines. They were often in a lot of accidents. They were expensive to insure. They really gulped down gas. They contributed to air pollution. As emission control standards were tightened, the performance dropped off. The economy was starting to struggle. And there were increasing laws for federal standards on new cars. So all of these factors really sent the muscle car segment into a nosedive. A lot of former muscle car owners moved to compact cars with V8s, not as big very often as the huge motors in the mid-sized muscle cars. An example, a Dodge Dart Swinger and a Demon. My brother-in-law, Kirk, had a 68 Dodge Dart with a 383 V8. Very nice car. There was the Chevy Nova SS. American Motors had the Hornet SC360, but there was no Pontiac in this segment. Pontiac in the US was completely shut out of this really growing compact performance market. Now it offered the Firebird in the pony car segment and the GTO in the intermediate segment, but no compact car. At least no Pontiac in this segment in the USA. In Canada, there had been the Acadian SS 350, billed as Acadian's muscle car for several years. So Pontiac dealers in Canada were well ahead of their counterparts in the US when it came to offering a high-performance compact, their version of the Chevy SS. Well, the answer for Pontiac in the USA was the Ventura, which came out in mid-1971. It was called the Ventura II because in the early 60s, there had been a full-sized model called the Ventura. So this was the reborn Ventura II. One author said it's little more than a Chevrolet Nova in disguise, and not much of a disguise at that. The frontal styling was unique to the Pontiac model, but virtually everything else about the car was pure Chevy. The Detroit Free Press said, with the market continuing to shift towards smaller cars, Pontiac has needed an entry in that segment, and the absence of one clearly has hurt the division's sales. The new compact Ventura made the cover of Motor Trend magazine in March of 71 under the headline Pontiac 71 and a half economy car. Motor Trend said not only is their tasteful redone variant of Pontiac split grille front end a welcome extension of the Nova, but the interiors were plushed up to Pontiac's measure, and it feels a little more substantial than a Nova. I mean, Pontiac had always been a little more expensive and perhaps a little more luxurious than their Chevrolet counterparts over the years, and this was continuing with the Ventura. Now, the Ventura was a big hit in the marketplace. Other GM brands also wanted their own compact car. Pontiac's retrimmed Nova had proven so successful. Oldsmobile got its version of the Nova for 73, called the Olds Omega. And it was no surprise when Buick got its version called the Apollo halfway through the 73 model year. So the concept of changing the trim on the very popular Chevy II for other corporate brands spread first to Pontiac, then Oldsmobile, and then Buick. But this was a concept that actually began with the Canadian Acadian in the fall of 1961. Now, to make room for the introduction of the Ventura in March of 71 in both Canada and the US, the Canadian-only Acadian stopped production in February of 71. Now, by the way, the Acadian name was brought back for 76 on a retrimmed subcompact Chevrolet Chevette for Pontiac dealers in Canada. Familiar tune, placing the Pontiac logo in the center of the grille and on the steering wheel, adding some Acadian nameplates was about all it did to convert the Chevette to the Acadian. Here's another case of history repeating itself. Starting with the 81 model year, Pontiac dealers in the USA got their version of a Chevette. It was called the Pontiac T1000. Now, oddly enough, the T1000 was also sold in Canada alongside the Acadian in Pontiac showrooms. Now, Canadians love their small cars, and Pontiac dealers were now offering two Chevette-sized vehicles, the Acadian and the T1000. A variation of the Acadian name with the final letter dropped to create Acadia is still with us today. GMC in both Canada and the US used the Acadian name for a crossover, starting with the 2007 model year, and it's still offered today. So that's the story of the unique all-Canadian Acadian. It was created out of necessity for Pontiac dealers. It proved successful in the marketplace, and it was a marketing concept that was borrowed by Pontiac in the USA a decade later, and then was passed along to Oldsmobile and Buick. Today, Acadians and Beaumonts are popular with car collectors and something of a curiosity when displayed at car shows in the USA, or when people from the United States are visiting Canada and see these cars at car shows and cruise nights. So, are there any questions about the all-Canadian Acadian?
Thanks so much, Dale. As people type in questions as usual, I've got a couple of my own. First off, do we know how many of these cars have survived? Because we're talking pretty hefty production numbers here, but I can't say personally as a as a car curator I've ever stumbled across any in the Canadian collector scene.
Well, they do show up occasionally at cruise nights and car shows, and I've seen a few. And I guess one of the advantages is, when it comes to getting parts, many of the parts from the Chevy II will fit on the Acadian from the 60s. So that's, I guess their survival is partly because they're sort of the another version of the very popular Chevy II, which clearly outsold the Acadian. But yeah, there's still quite a few of them out there. I don't have specific numbers,
Mhm.
but
Do we
certainly
know
rarer than Novas or Chevy IIs, but yeah, still quite a few out there.
Do we know why Acadian specifically? I always wonder when I look, especially at this era where everything has a name. Why Acadian of all things? Why that particular bit of Canadiana? Do we have any insight into the creative process, I guess?
I don't know why that name was chosen, but obviously there was a lot of brand identity, as I mentioned, the other products that used the Acadian name. So it was probably a very like nobody said, well, an Acadian, what is that? There were all kinds of products called Acadian. So that's part of it. It's also distinctly Canadian, more so than Chevy II. And of course, a lot of the other automakers also had some unique Canadian only names that probably meant more in Canada than they would in the USA, like the Meteor Niagara, for example, or the Lemoyne or the Rideau. There were a lot of car names that automakers for their Canadian market wanted to use some unique Canadian names.
Thinking of the eventful Frontenac from Ford.
Yes. Yes, that's right.
Sick of the
Which
exact same.
was something like an Acadian in that it was sold at Mercury dealers to provide Mercury dealers with a compact car to sell because there was the Ford Falcon at Ford dealers. Mercury dealers didn't have a product immediately, so they quickly retrimmed the Ford Falcon, put some maple leaves on it, much like the Acadian, and there was the Ford Frontenac. And
Mhm.
again, a very Canadian name because in the 30s there had been a Frontenac, and of course that name came from Count Frontenac, who was a leader back in I think the 1700s or maybe the 1600s, but it was certainly a very distinct Canadian name.
If you ever want to see either kind of Frontenac, we have both at the museum, though. One of them is a slightly rusty pile of spare parts and has been so for about 70 years. Long story. Anyway, Peter is wondering what the price difference was between the Chevy II and the Acadian.
It depended on the year. It was anywhere from about $10 to $50, depending on trim. And sometimes it's hard to get absolute identical ones. Trim's often different, but I think the suggested retail price was about around $20 to $30 more for the Acadian. So what's that? 1 or 2% really on the total price. So not much of a difference really.
Interesting. Yeah, there's very much this idea in history that, especially in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the cars that sold best in Canada were, you know, a fairly inexpensive car, but that looked fancier than it was. You see that a lot with Mercury and with Frontenac and with the sort of Plymouth Dodge mixes. So I guess this is very much more the same.
Yes, indeed. Yes, the Plymouth Dodge mixes the Plodges, as they were nicknamed unofficially.
Now,
And
was there recognition at the time that this was the later versions of the Acadian were sort of the first real Canadian muscle car? Did anybody sit down and say, "Hey, this is an all Canadian muscle car," or was it just is this something we've sort of come to appreciate later?
I think really appreciate it later because of course, there was the Chevy Nova SS with 396. So, and because the Chevy Nova was, uh, I guess, better known, it was more recognizable. So but the Acadian SS with the 350, there was a muscle car. And it's interesting that I mentioned the Ventura near the end, which is sort of the next chapter of this Acadian of having a Pontiac trimmed Chevy II, essentially. Uh, the Ventura in 1974, they brought out the GTO, or they revived the GTO name, actually moved it from the mid-size Le Mans to the compact uh, Pontiac Ventura. So that was the GTO. So again, Pontiac by 74 now had a high performance compact car in both Canada and the US. But as this shows, Acadian was doing that several years earlier with the Acadian SS.
Lee's asking, and Lee, I'm gonna take your question and broaden it out a bit more. He's asking for production numbers of 63 Beaumonts, but more broadly, are there good records for overall production numbers of the individual makes of Acadians? Because from what you've been saying, some of them were produced in fairly huge numbers, and other of the higher end ones, there's only a couple hundred of them made, weren't there?
Yes, and it is sometimes difficult to find those numbers. And I've looked at a lot of back copies of newspapers, and you may have noticed I had a couple of charts there with sales numbers of the first 6 months. Well, why not for the full year? I couldn't find the full year ones. I could find the 6 months ones, often from newspapers, where they had the production totals. So it can be tricky to find those numbers, and if you are looking at production numbers, you also have to be careful between very often there's model year and calendar year. So, and those can be quite different. I mean, the model year is when they started making the 62s in the fall of 61 until the summer of 62. That's one way to measure it. But the other is how many did they sell from January 1st to December 31st of any year. And there can also be a difference, but sometimes you find the sales numbers over here and you find the production numbers because some that were produced were shipped to other countries. Actually, there were some Acadians shipped to places like Chile and Venezuela and a few other countries in very small numbers, probably in the hundreds. But um, it can be tricky finding really good production numbers because of those things. Is it model year, calendar year? Sometimes too, they have different ways of keeping track of them. Do you take, I mean, 64, 65, sometimes they don't break out the Beaumont versus other Acadians. Sometimes they'll lump them all together. So it can be tricky finding the correct numbers. So that's why sometimes it's, well, this over here says so many were made, but this over here says has a different number. How can that be? That's how that can be.
Yeah, I can speak to this as well, Lee. At some point in the late 80s or early 90s, GM Canada did a big clear out of their archives. And one of the casualties of that was a lot of the central sort of data sheets for production numbers from usually sort of the 40s through the 60s were trashed, basically. So, in looking for specific numbers for Canadian cars from this exact time period, those kind of breakdowns often just don't exist. It's a kind of question we get asked at the museum all the time, and we often just physically don't have a reference point. We can't tell you because the document containing that information no longer exists in its primary archive. If you can find somebody who at the time recorded this information and go from there, good on you. But there's no one central source, which is endlessly frustrating for this kind of research.
I've often found that back copies of Financial Post, they used to give the weekly production runs and
Mhm.
sometimes articles on total sales. Those can be helpful, but that could take a lot of digging to try to find those numbers.
Yeah, the business monograph type stuff that like annual business reports will sometimes have similar stuff, but it's a question of if and where you can find that. Library and Archives Canada might be your best bet, weirdly enough. Not the usual place you'd expect to research cars. Um, Tad's asking, because this comes up a lot, especially in this presentation, the acknowledgement, even at the time, that an Acadian is just a rebadged Pontiac. Did this knowledge that GM was sort of selling the same car 3 or 4 times over, did we get a sense that people cared? Did it impact people's faith in the company?
Oh, I think it was just sort of a personal styling preference. I mean, people who, may hate Chevrolet love the Pontiac, or even the marketing thing of trying to move up. If you go back the early days where uh, GM wanted you to start in a Chevrolet and then, a few years later move up to a Pontiac because you were doing better and they were similar and a little more money. And then you could go up to an Olds and then a Buick and then ultimately a Cadillac. I mean, that was sort of the idea. So I think a lot of people, were proud if they could have moved from a regular old Chevy to a Pontiac, even if it was, you know, only a few $100s more back in the 60s or 70s, and really the same car underneath, right? I mean, the same. So it really came down to style and personal preference. And sometimes you'd hear people say, "Oh, I don't want one of those whatevers because the tail lights look so odd on them." I want the big tail lights on the other car either, or they're too big. I like the little round tail lights. So really just personal preference a lot of times because they are the same underneath, and especially the full size Pontiacs, which were generally speaking smaller than their U.S. counterparts. The Canadian ones were large because Canadians like smaller cars. The Canadian Pontiacs of the 40s, 50s, 60s, not all of them, but many of them were essentially Chevrolet bodies with Pontiac trim on them, and often Chevrolet engines. So while an V8 might be standard in the US on a particular model, in the Canadian, the six-cylinder was standard. And it wasn't just GM, other automakers did the same. Dodges in Canada were often different. than the ones in the US. And by different, I mean a little smaller and more like a Plymouth.
A related question. This may be, I seem to recall this mostly applies with 1950s stuff, but there's sort of, you often see Canadian cars getting high-end luxury features a lot later than their American equivalents because the factories weren't modernized enough to produce them. I'm thinking like, I want to say Canada got record players in cars sort of 5 to 10 years after the US, and air conditioning came in here a lot later. Do we see any of that with the Acadian?
Well, I mentioned how the air conditioning came after several years in the late 60s. So it had been on the road for many years. But again, a lot of it comes down to consumer demand. And if there's not a lot of customers saying, gee, can't I get this with air conditioning? They're
Mhm.
probably not going to put air conditioning in. And I imagine they didn't decide to put air in because they thought it was a nice idea. They were probably getting people saying, gee, my brother-in-law's got a full-size Pontiac and he's got air conditioning. I want air conditioning, but I want the smaller car. Why can't I get air conditioning? I mean, there are probably a lot of responses to just consumer demands. And again, with the Canadian market being different, and generally speaking, it's probably easier to get by without air conditioning in Canada than in certain parts of the USA,
Yeah.
given our climate differences.
I believe Canadian cars tended to get heaters as standard more frequently than not. I
Yes.
wonder why.
I remember once I was in a cab in Toronto and I got chatting to the cab driver about cars, which I often do. And he put the heater on. He was from, I believe, Brazil, and it was somewhere in South America, but he was talking about some of the differences. And he said when he used to drive in Brazil, they did not have heaters in cars. He comes to Canada, they got heaters in all the cars. So again, local market demand.
Yeah.